And to set the tone, I want to offer you a quotation which I got from a wonderful American storyteller, Laura Sims. She says that an anthropologist by the name of Dr. Francis Harwood, who was a student of the famous Margaret Mead, once asked a Sioux elder why people tell stories. And the elder answered, in order to become human beings. And she asked, aren't we human beings already? He smiled. Not everyone makes it, he said. I love that because it reminds me how close to the heart of being human storytelling is. I think it's fundamental to who we are and how we are in the world. And it kind of lies behind what I want to talk about today. I believe that storytelling is at the heart of our sense of self. Our sense of identity is a more or less coherent set of stories that we tell ourselves, that others tell us, that we tell others. And if those stories are stuck and rigid, we're stuck and rigid. And if they're not sufficiently coherent, we're rather lost in the world. Stories are how we create community, how we bring people together, whether it's intimate relations or whether it's an organisation or a society. There's something fundamental about the sharing of story that has to do with belonging or not belonging. And not belonging is a very painful condition. And one of the things to think about today, I think, in our current situation is that some of our normal ways of belonging have been lost to us. Our normal ways of connecting and collecting together and our normal ways of sharing the stories that we need to share in order to feel that we belong have been lost to us. The third crucial way in which stories influence our lives is that they are the lenses through which we judge what is possible and desirable. So you see that very clearly writ large on the political stage. But the way we see the world is, in a sense, a kind of implicit story. We had a story of how the world worked. It was different for us in different societies, but it was more or less stable. And then along comes something, whether it's the financial crash of 2008 or whether it's now COVID, that shows how vulnerable those storied foundations are. That what we thought was possible may not be possible. Certainly not if we go about it in the way that we've always gone about it. So these stories, I maintain, at the level of identity, who I think I am in the world, how we connect in the world, what we think is possible in the world, have all been shaken tremendously by the effects of COVID in different parts of the world. Let me share with you one of the key ideas I want to bring to this, which is the idea of system world and life world. These two worlds, the world of work, the world of achievement, the world of production and productivity, the world of earning a living, and the world of family and community, have been for many years quite separate. We go to work. And one of the things that's become very apparent, I think, is that we have become used to behaving very differently at work than we do at home, to thinking very differently at work than the way we do at home. That the system world has its own kind of logic. Organisations are there to achieve certain purposes. They have a rational, purposive logic to them. We set targets, for example. We believe that we must organise our time in particular ways. It's quite a digitised world, if you like, quite a left-brained world. And the world of home has a different set of values, if you like. They're more communitarian. They're more about development, family, spirit, hope, aspiration. This current crisis has brought these two worlds crashing together. I see this as a great opportunity. Like many of you, I'm at home at the moment. My home life and my work life have become almost indistinguishable. And one of the things I hope happens as a result of this is that we're able to reflect on the values that we bring to our work. Because the values that are those of the system world, uninfluenced by the life world, are instrumental and exploitative, essentially. Whereas at home, we care for our families, our communities, and the future. We bring a different sensibility to how we make decisions. Now we are working from home, very many of us, and our human vulnerability and our neediness, our simple human needs, are much more visible as we work together. And for me, that's something I really welcome. In a way, I would argue that it's been the exclusion of these life world values from the system world that has led us into so much trouble. So that's a sort of backdrop to it. And I'm thinking here, how do we bring story, which is essentially something from the life world, and how do we bring it now in the current situation into our system world life, into the world of our work, our organising, our leading, in ways that recognise our vulnerability and our humanity and our neediness. Maybe we can't cover ourselves with the cloak of invulnerability. And maybe that's a really good thing. I began by suggesting that many of the ways we story the world for ourselves, for our communities, our groups and our societies have been shaken badly. And there's a notion that I find very helpful, which is one which we call narrative wreckage. This is a little meme that simply represents this sense of being washed up on the shore. What happens when the stories through which you make sense of yourself and your life and your community and your world don't make sense anymore? What happens when they're no longer a reasonable relationship between the stories and the meaning they offer and the world that we're living in? What happens to our change of identity if the stories no longer make sense? Who am I? That's a question I think many people have asked, including me, in the wake of this crisis, of this time of change and challenge. It's not just how am I, but who am I now? With so many of the markers of my identity changed or not available. Who do we relate to? The patterns of relating that we're used to no longer exist in the same way. And there's a huge change, I think, in our expectations about how the world works and the opportunities that it offers to us. I'm thinking of my young granddaughter, for example, who's just finished university and is 21 years old. And the expectations she is carrying into her adulthood have been severely threatened. Because storytelling is so close to the heart of being human, when those stories are fundamentally shaken, we are lost. We don't know who we are. We have to find new stories or find our way back to the old stories. There are two characters here who I'd like to just introduce you to, because I think they say something fundamental about how story can help us in these circumstances. The one on the left is Karen Blixen. She wrote Out of Africa, which was made into a famous film with Meryl Streep. And she lost everything, I suppose. She lost her father to suicide. She lost her farm to bankruptcy. She lost her lover, Dennis Finch Hatton, to an accident. And she returned home ill and almost bankrupt. But she understood something. And she once said famously, all sorrows can be borne if you put them in a story or tell a story about them. We can't manage grief without speaking of it. We have to tell our story. And Maya Angelou said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." And I think, wonderful as those statements are as general statements, they have particular resonance and meaning now in the conditions that we're in. What are the griefs? What are the sorrows that we're holding that we need to share, and need to share as leaders, and as leaders enable our people to share with each other and with us? What are the untold stories, the ones that have hitherto not been able to be told in the workplace, the life world stories that perhaps haven't found a home in the system world? And how can they be told? A writer called Arthur Frank, who I very much like, talks about this, and I think this offers something rather practical. This is where I'm trying to go with this. Really, there are three responses when the stories that comprise your world collapse. What do we do about it? Well, at first, it's almost inevitably we're stuck in the wreckage of it. We can't see a way out. We can't make sense of what happened. It's a passive condition. We repeat the same old story. We go over it and over and over. When things first happen, we're in a state of shock. We can't really articulate. We can't see a way forward. But we need to be able to speak of our confusion and of our difficulty and of our pain. But if that's all we can do, we can never move on. So then we're faced with a choice. Is it a question of getting back to the way things were, which you might call the restitution narrative, a return to normality? We can fix this. It's an active state. It's about repairing. It's reparative. If you damage your car in an accident, you take it to the garage, you can get it fixed, and it's as good as new. And sometimes that's a really helpful attitude to carry into a situation of narrative wreckage. This is broken, it can be fixed. I'm thinking perhaps of a world-class athlete who suffers a serious injury, fracture perhaps. Then it's a realistic assessment that they can heal, they can return, they can go back, things can be as good as they were before, they can return to normal. But that is not always possible, and perhaps it's not always desirable. And an alternative kind of story is what Arthur Frank calls the quest story. We are going through the wreckage, not just getting over it. We're not stuck in it. We have to get through this. Things will be different, and we can learn from this. It's not a blip. It's real, it's happening, it's changing our world. How then can we actively engage with that? What are the stories that will help us do that will help us do more than say, let's get back to normal? And I think that if let's get back to normal is the watchword of the restitution story, then let's not waste this opportunity is the watchword of the quest story. And I think you can see, certainly in the United Kingdom, I don't know how it is elsewhere in the world particularly, but I have some idea that there are kind of divides about this. Do we really believe we can go back? Do we want to go back to how things were before? Or has the crisis revealed divisions and disparities and inequalities and unfairnesses in our societies that we can change? Never waste a good crisis. This is a crisis. This is an opportunity to make transformational change. But we have to let go of how things were. If we're going to address any of these ways of responding to narrative wreckage, then although I'm a promoter of story and storytelling, and I work with what I call narrative leadership, and I often help people tell stories, I maintain, and I heard the previous speaker say it, the most important thing a leader can do is listen. Listen as much as they speak. Helping people tell their important leadership act. And I talk about narrative leadership as creating a healthy flow of stories. I am not a marketing storyteller. I work with leaders and leading and leadership. And I think leading is an ongoing social process with people. And so we have to engage them in the ongoing conversation. We have to build stories together. It's very rare, in my experience, for a leader to need to or to be able to stand up and give the killer inspirational story. Perhaps it's a temperamental issue, but I think it's more about listening, engaging, creating a flow of stories and building stories together. Listening. What does listening mean? For storytellers, what does it mean? Well, so often listening is simply, at best, giving someone else an opportunity to speak, or at worst, waiting till they finish speaking so that you can speak. But I love this idea that actually you're not listening to someone unless you're willing to be changed by what you hear. And I learned that from an old traditional story that I was telling one day, that in it one of the characters has this revelation as this love relationship he's in is teetering on the brink, that he has to listen. And in order to listen, he has to allow himself to be changed by what he hears. And for me, there's a beautiful metaphor for this, which came from this wonderful woman, Ursula Le Guin, one of my favourite writers. I suppose you might call her a feminist science fiction writer, amongst other things. And she talks about listening as amoeba sex. You know amoebas, these single-cell creatures that float around in the sort of protozoic fluid and in the oceans and in our bodies. Amoebas replicate by dividing. They simply pull themselves in half and divide into two. But sometimes, when somehow this mass of amoebas senses there is a need for a richer genetic mix, they join together. They stay joined together and they pass genetic material between one and the other. And the flow is in both directions. And that's what I mean by listening. That's what I mean by leaders listening. So taking it into the realm of leadership, let's briefly touch upon how that relates to what I call heroic and post-heroic leadership. I love this little cartoon from one of my favourite cartoonists, the Australian Michael Leunig. On the left, we have the kind of heroic notion, the faster, higher, stronger, the Olympic ideal. And on the right, the rather more, humane, thoughtful, slower, deeper, wiser, perhaps more accepting of our imperfections. I maintain that the time for heroic leadership has passed. It's time for a change in style of leadership. I think it's heroic leadership that has got us into this mess, and I don't think it's going to get us out of it. As a teller of traditional stories, as well as a worker in organisations, I look to what traditional stories tell us about what's the difference between heroic leadership and post-heroic leadership. Well, heroic leadership and the notion of the hero's journey is a very popular one, much promoted by colleagues who are storytellers. But let's look at the kind of story. Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey. The hero's journey and heroic being in the world is essentially an adventure, a young person's adventure. It's outgoing, it's achievement oriented. There's a call to adventure. There are trials and ordeals and helpers and mentors, and the hero or heroine gets through by courage, magic and luck, and they bring back some wonderful gift to the world. And usually at the end of those stories, they become kings or queens. They transcend, they enter the adult world, and they often end happily ever after. That's the heroic journey. It holds the promise of happily ever after. Now, I'm saying that a different kind of story offers us a template for our time, and that's the post-heroic story. The story that begins after happily ever after. It doesn't start with a call to adventure. It starts with a fall from grace. This journey begins when things go wrong. This is not a young person's story. And this is not a story that's full of magic and courage and luck. This requires something very different. This is about fortitude, endurance, persistence. It's about understanding what really matters and hanging in there until you get it. And the nature of the stories is very different. For those of you who know the Russian stories, I would contrast, on the one hand, the Firebird. That's a hero's journey. You know, young Ivan finds the Firebird's feather and goes through a series of adventures, as a result of which he marries Vasilisa and becomes the next star. Contrast that with the wonderful story of Go I know not whither, bring back I know not what, in which the hero or the protagonist of that story is on pain of death told just that: go I know not whither, bring back I know not what. And by the way, it's only to be found at the ends of the world. And that's, to me, a sense of where we are in our adventure as a human species. We've had the heroic adventure. We have experienced what passes for happily ever after. We have now living in the wake of a fall from grace. What do these stories teach us? They teach us that life is not about achievement, but about endurance and about being true to what really matters. I love the fact that these stories offer us something. So what stories do we tell? What stories are needed at this time? The world, I think, is on a tipping point. And I maintain that the stories we tell are fateful. We create, at least in part, our world and create how we perceive it and the possibilities through it by the way we story it, by the ways in which we attribute meaning and significance to the world and our own lived experience within it. So we have a choice. And every time we tell a story, every time we engage with someone, we are, whether we think it or not, whether we intend it or not, we are making a choice. What is it we have to say about the world? Because it's a bit like they say in appreciative inquiry, you know, the questions you ask are fateful. I say that the stories we tell are fateful. So let me give you an example of that. I was thinking about that, and someone asked me to tell them a story about, you know, my COVID experience. This, I understand, is what it looks like, the little beast. And we all have different experiences of living through this time. And I could tell a story of isolation, of loneliness. I've been in this house for 12 months on my own with my dog, which I'm mostly quite happy about. But I could tell that story of the difficulty of that, of the loneliness of it, of sometimes the wondering whether I'm going a bit crazy, the worries about health. I could tell stories about restriction of freedom, about being forbidden to do certain things. I could tell a story about illness. I could tell a story about the death of friends. I could tell all those stories. And maybe sometimes there's a place for them. But the story I choose to tell today, and the stories I'm suggesting we think about, are what are the stories of hope and gratitude that we might have to tell from within this experience. And this is my little story of hope and gratitude. This is a picture taken last summer, August, outside my house from the street looking into the front garden of my cottage in England. And this was the day I realised that I had become a roadside shrine. I don't know if it happens in part of the world that you're listening from, but if someone dies on a roadside accident, very often people start putting flowers and gifts beside it. And in other cultures, there are little shrines by the side of the roads where offerings are made. And I had this kind of amused insight. People started leaving me gifts. I don't know where they came from. I was left flowers. There's a little pot of jam. There are vegetables there. The small community that I live in had sort of adopted me, in a sense, and were making sure that I was all right and showing that they cared for me. And I found that so moving. It's what I take from this experience as the most valuable lesson of all, the most valuable story to tell, was how in this very difficult time, people who themselves were suffering difficulty went out of their way to look after me. So I think one of the things we can do, as well as helping people tell the painful stories of what their experience is, the stories that need to be told, the sorrowful story, the untold story, can we also look for what has hope and gratitude from within this experience? Can we share those stories? Can we not just tell them, but can we invite them? Can we invoke them? Let us take the mask off. Let us show up for our work, show up as leaders, as humanly as we possibly can. And I think that's something that's very difficult, but it's not very complicated. And I offer for you to think about something I learnt years ago from a wonderful writer called Angelis Arian. And she wrote a book called The Fourfold Way, in which she distills a whole range of indigenous wisdoms from around the world to come up with this set of 4 precepts. And I think these are wonderful. They're an aspiration. There's something to be reached for. There's something to be attempted. I don't think anyone can say, I do all of this. But if we carry these intentions with us into our work in the world and our being with other people, in our families, in our intimate relations, then I think it makes all the difference. First of all, take the mask off. Show up as who you really are. Vulnerable, needy, brilliant, capable, clever, imaginative. Bring yourself. Don't simply say, how am I expected to behave around here? Pay attention to what you say. What has heart and meaning for you? What needs to be addressed? What needs to be said? What really matters? And then when you speak, speak your truth. And do it without blaming or judging others. And then we come back to a quality of listening. Be open to outcome. Be willing to be changed by what you hear. And if we carry these precepts into the world, in our storytelling and in our being, and in our relating and in our leading, I believe that they really can help us move forward. They can take us out of this prison of the system world that locks us into a particular way of being. They can open us to bringing together these worlds, which have become so divided that the human world of the life world becomes integrated with the system world. And unless we can achieve that, I think we are doomed to return to the same problems that we had before. If we can, then perhaps we have the capacity to envisage a different kind of future and live into it together. So we have just 3 minutes left, I think, on the presentation side. And I'm going to finish by telling a tiny little traditional story, which gave me great comfort. When the pandemic hit UK early on last year, March last year, my mental health was under some pressure. I had panic attacks, I was ill, I was deeply disturbed by what was going on. And it took me quite a while to settle into myself and understand how I needed to be to come through something. And this story I remembered, and it helped me hugely, and I just offer it to you as a tiny little offering. It comes from the Hebraic tradition. It's a story of King Solomon, who, as we know, was a wise ruler. In fact, the archetypal wise ruler. Solomon had an advisor, a general called Ben-Yaniah, who was a proud and, truth to tell, difficult sort of man. Ben-Yaniah approached Solomon one day in the court in front of everyone, and he said, "Sire, the Feast of the Tabernacles approaches. It's traditional for your courtiers to buy you a gift. What would you like? Name anything in the world and I will give it to you." And Solomon thought, well, this is an opportunity, I think, to bring this man down a peg or two. "Bring me," he said, "something that will make a happy man sad and a sad man happy." And Ben-Yaniah said, "What do you mean?" "Anything," said Solomon. "I don't mind what it is, but it must be capable of making a happy man sad and a sad man happy." And so Ben-Yaniah, who'd given his word, went off searching the 4 corners of the kingdom for something that would fulfill those criteria. And as the days and weeks passed, he found nothing. And the night before the feast, when the very next day he'd given his word that he would give such a gift, he searched into the night. It was late, it was evening, the souks, the marketplaces were all closing down, and he tried one last stall. It was a jeweller's stall. A little old man was there packing up for the night, and Ben-Yaniah thought, well, there's nothing to lose. And he went up to him and he said, "I'm searching for a gift for the King Solomon. and it must make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. I have no idea what it might be, but do you have such a thing? And the old man said, yes, I think I do. And he went to the back of the store, and from a drawer he brought out a ring, a simple copper ring, not gold, not silver, no diamonds, no rubies, no emeralds, a simple copper ring. Here, he said, this is what you need. Really? Yeah. And so Ben-Yonah handed over the money and wrapped the ring in a silk cloth. And the next day at the Feast of Tabernacles, in front of everyone, he walked the full length of the court, and he went down on one knee and he presented his gift to Solomon. Sire, he said, I brought you something that will make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. I have fulfilled my promise. And Solomon opened the cloth and took out the ring, and he saw this tawdry object, and then suddenly he noticed that there were words engraved upon it. And as he read the words, he looked round his court and he saw the richness of his household and the number of his wives and the beauty of his concubines, and he began to weep. And then he began to think of his people, the poor, the lame, the halt, the sick, the hungry, and he began to smile. Because on that ring was written these words, this too shall pass. And it said that Solomon wore that ring from that day until the end of his life. And it was that enabled his wisdom and modesty to prevail. That's the end of my presentation, folks. I'm open to questions. I'm hoping that you have some.
You had my heart the whole time. I love how deeply you view the ways that the story defines in terms of meaning. Thank you so much. I love
Great
it.
pleasure. Great pleasure.
Let's support Geoff with our fires and our questions. So if you have any, please go for the chat. Just look at the reaction there.
Hi, is this a name I recognise? Marianne, hello. That's lovely. Jane, hi, nice to see you. Oh, Dan's there too. Lovely to see some folks.
Yeah, we have such a bunch of people.
Yeah.
Geoff, but before we dive into the questions, I guess we have time for one if it comes. Just out of curiosity, this is such a deep approach you're talking about to the stories, but a lot of people, a lot of leaders I know, are still on the place where they are, appreciating only the power of story to influence.
Yeah.
Are there any ways that we can help them embrace this kind of story you've been teaching us?
That's a very good question. And when I work with people in workshops, I try, corporate workshops and the like, I often bring people together and invite them in small groups to tell very simple human stories to each other. Mm-hmm. And that results in several things. One is everyone's able to tell a story, and they discover that even if they think they can't. They also discover what makes the story more interesting, but they meet each other at a more human level. And I have done simple exercises like story circles, for example, with the right trigger, and people who you might think are very severe and proper. I did this for years with some of our most senior civil servants in UK. And they'd say, I've known this person for 10 years, but I didn't know them until now. Because the mask comes off. So I think it's experiential. I think that the best thing, I can make an argument for it and you can believe it, but actually an experience of it is the most powerful thing. I think there is some recognition. I was asked by a colleague who is in Mumbai to do a webinar, which I did, and someone picked it up, and I ended up doing a leadership webinar, about an hour, for a client. I won't say who it was, but it was a well-known global company. And they came to us and said, could you help us understand how to communicate and lead with authenticity and vulnerability in this virtual world? And I thought, that's just about the best request I've ever had, because that's mostly what I'm trying to do. But that's what it was like, an understanding. And I think we have this opportunity in this COVID world. We are seeing each other. You know, you're in a room in your home, probably I'm in my study, my dog's behind me, I'm just hoping he won't bark. We actually engage very differently. And so I think that we have this chance, and we can let it slip. We can just go for the restitution narrative and pretend that the world's going to be okay again. And it won't be unless we change. Unless we change how we are together. So that's my attempt to work with it. Yeah. Gosh, I'm so touched by the comments. One of them says, "This too shall pass. That's why my husband said in my first labour." That's one of the lovely things in there. So yeah, someone saying, "What's the after COVID story?" It's for us to co-create. Is the after COVID story? We don't know, but how we are with each other will determine it. You know, are we really concerned to not leave people behind? Because one of the things that's shown up, certainly in the UK, is the devastating effect of the kind of differentials in wealth. There are chunks of our society who have struggled and struggled and struggled. And, you know, if we go back and pretend that it hasn't happened, it's unforgivable. Unforgivable. So let's kind of embrace what has come out of this in terms of, for a while at least, meeting on a common human platform. Speaking of which, that's my dog, because someone's at the door. But I'm going to look out the window for a second. Hang on. I won't go away.
That's life, folks. That's just life.
That's all right. Some kind person has left me a parcel outside. So I'm still a roadside shrine.
Somebody knows the name of your dog. It's
yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, Rafaro knows. Hi, Rafaro. Let's see your dog. Yeah. If he comes back up, I will.
Oh, lovely.
Hey.
Okay. I'm just so in love with everything you say. It's so touching, and
thank you.
My fellow colleague is writing me back in the chat that you are, as a Russian saying goes, a human being / soul, like this warm kind of human being.
Bless you.
So
thank you.
I have a question. I dreamt of asking you.
Yeah.
So what if the story, Her Majesty, has come to life and was about to teach leaders one thing and one thing only? That one thing would be?
It would be, I thought about this, and it's essentially about listening. It's about, your job is to listen. Your job is to listen to your heart, to yourself, and it's to listen to what the world needs. You know, on narrative leadership, I work with this notion of a tree. It's a very simple meme, and it's about reaching deep down into who we are, what we really care about in the world, and what we want to do with our lives, and how we want to show up, and how, you know, legacy we want to leave behind, and reaching out and listening. What does the world call from us? And if we can find that place between who we are, what we care about, and what the world is calling for, then we have something to say that matters. So for me, story says listen to yourself, listen to the world. If you do that, you will know what story to tell, because it'll be a story, your story, and a story of this time. I think there's a question come in. I don't know if there's a chance to answer it. That Alessandro
I wanted
are we running out of time, or
no? I wanted just to suggest, if you have the time, could you stay with us in the chat so we can move to the next speaker, and you would be here with us as.
Yeah, if that's possible, I'm very happy to do that.
Just, you know, before going off air, thank you once again. As always, you're a gift. You're a blessing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a delight, and thank you so. It's amazing what you've done this week to organise it and bring people together. It's a fantastic achievement, and you've handled it with grace and humility and humour, under what must have been some pressure, I imagine. But yeah, I'll stay and try and address a couple of the questions in here.
Thank you.